Look at a sunflower head. Really look at it. Count the spiral lines running from the center out to the edge, curving one way. Now count the ones curving the other way. If you count carefully, you'll almost always land on two numbers, something like 34 and 55, or 55 and 89, or on a really big sunflower, 89 and 144.
Those aren't random numbers. They're consecutive numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, the same sequence where each number is the sum of the two before it. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and on. Nobody planted that pattern into the sunflower. No gardener sat there with a calculator. And yet, this same exact math shows up again and again and again across parts of the natural world that have never once communicated with each other.
That's what this video is actually about. Not the idea that math is everywhere, which is a vague, meaningless statement that sounds profound, but explains nothing. This is about specific equations, discovered by specific mathematicians, sometimes centuries before anyone found the exact same pattern already sitting inside a plant, an animal, or a weather system. And in at least one case, the connection people usually cite as the best example of this is actually wrong. Let's start with that sunflower, because the Fibonacci numbers aren't the real trick. The real trick is the angle. Look at a plant stem from directly above, where new leaves or seeds are added one at a time as the plant grows. Each new leaf has to go somewhere. If the plant just went with a clean, simple angle, like exactly 1/3 of a full turn, every third leaf would stack directly on top of an earlier one, blocking its sunlight. Instead, most plants rotate each new leaf by almost exactly 137.5 degrees. That specific number is called the golden angle, and it comes directly from the golden ratio, roughly 1.618, a number first written about mathematically over 2,000 years ago by the Greek mathematician Euclid. Here's why that particular angle, and only that angle, works so well. The golden ratio is, mathematically, the number that's hardest to approximate using simple fractions. That sounds like a strange thing to care about until you realize what it means for a growing plant. If a plant rotated its leaves by a nice simple fraction of a turn, like exactly 2/5, the leaves would eventually line up in tight overlapping columns, wasting huge amounts of sunlight on leaves shading each other out. But the golden angle is mathematically the least likely angle to ever repeat a pattern. Every new leaf lands in the biggest remaining gap. Over the plant's entire life, this single angle packs the maximum possible number of leaves into the space with the least possible overlap. Nobody designed this on purpose. Plants that happened to grow at close to this angle captured more sunlight than their neighbors, grew faster, and reproduced more successfully. Over millions of generations, evolution quietly converged on almost exactly the one number that a mathematician, centuries later, would identify as the hardest number in existence to approximate. That's not decoration. That's an optimization problem, solved by blind trial and error that happens to have a name and an exact numerical value. Now here's where we need to correct something, because this is the point where almost every video on this topic gets something important wrong. You've probably heard that a Nautilus shell is a perfect example of the golden ratio, that famous spiral, expanding outward in exactly the golden proportion, one of nature's most photographed proofs of hidden mathematical beauty. It's in textbooks, it's in design classes, it's repeated constantly. And it's not quite true. A Nautilus shell is a real mathematically fascinating shape called a logarithmic spiral, a spiral that keeps the same overall shape as it grows larger, just scaled up, the same way you can zoom into a fractal and see a familiar pattern repeat. That part is genuinely true and genuinely elegant. But when researchers have actually measured real Nautilus shells, the growth ratio typically comes out closer to somewhere between 1.24 and 1.43, not 1.618. It's a beautiful logarithmic spiral. It's just not specifically the golden ratio. The golden ratio Nautilus is one of the most widely repeated scientific myths in pop culture. There's an ironic twist buried in this same shape's history. The Swiss mathematician Jacob Bernoulli in the late 1600s became completely obsessed with logarithmic spirals, the same math underlying the Nautilus. He found the shape so beautiful, so philosophically perfect, that he asked to have one engraved on his own tombstone, along with the Latin phrase eadem mutata resurgo, meaning, although changed, I shall arise the same. When Bernoulli died, the stonemason carving his memorial apparently didn't fully understand the mathematics and carved a different kind of spiral entirely, a simpler, non-logarithmic one, permanently, right there on the grave of the mathematician most associated with getting that exact shape right. So even the story about the math itself has a mistake baked into it, which is honestly a pretty perfect metaphor for how casually people tend to treat mathematical claims about nature, repeated so often, so confidently, that the actual data gets skipped entirely. Let's move to a case where the math is not exaggerated at all: the honeycomb. Every cell in a honeybee's comb is a hexagon, not roughly hexagonal, precisely, consistently six-sided, tiled edge to edge with no gaps. Mathematicians have known for a very long time that if you want to divide a flat surface into equal-sized regions using the least possible amount of wall material, a hexagonal grid is the most efficient shape available. More efficient than squares, more efficient than triangles. This idea is old. The Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro proposed it over 2,000 years ago, and it became known as the Honeycomb conjecture. But here's the part most people don't know. Nobody actually proved this mathematically until shockingly recently. Mathematician Thomas Hales at the University of Michigan finally published a rigorous proof of the honeycomb conjecture in 1999. That means honeybees had been building the single most materially efficient possible tiling shape for tens of millions of years, correctly, by instinct, roughly 2,000 years before Varro even guessed at the idea, and literally millennia before any human being could mathematically prove the bees were right. Bees aren't doing geometry. Each individual bee is just following a simple set of instinctual rules, building wax cells at a consistent angle and spacing relative to their neighbors. But run that simple local rule across an entire colony over and over, and the large-scale result is a mathematically optimal structure, one that took human civilization thousands of years of accumulated mathematics just to formally confirm. Now here's a pattern that's stranger still, because this one didn't start with someone observing nature and looking for the math. It started with a mathematician predicting a pattern nobody had found yet in an entirely different field. In 1952, the British mathematician Alan Turing, better known today for breaking Nazi Germany's Enigma code, published a paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. It had nothing to do with code breaking. Turing was trying to mathematically explain something biology hadn't figured out yet: how a developing embryo, starting from a uniform, featureless blob of cells, ends up with distinct patterns, like stripes or spots at all. Turing proposed a mathematical model involving two chemicals spreading through tissue at different speeds, one that promotes a pattern and one that suppresses it. Depending on how those two chemicals interact and diffuse, his equations predicted that a completely uniform starting surface should spontaneously organize itself into stripes, spots, or spiral patterns, all from simple chemistry, no blueprint required. At the time, this was pure mathematical theory. Nobody had identified the actual chemicals in a real embryo. Turing died in 1954, 2 years after publishing it, and for decades, his idea sat mostly as an interesting, unproven hypothesis. Then, starting in the 1990s and continuing through a landmark 2012 study published in the journal Science, researchers led by biologist Hrishikesh Sheth actually identified real genes in developing mouse embryos, specifically genes controlling the number of fingers and toes, that behave exactly the way Turing's equations predicted decades earlier, with zero knowledge of the actual biology involved. Zebra stripes, leopard spots, the patterns on tropical fish, even the spacing of your own fingers, all trace back to this same reaction-diffusion mathematics. A codebreaker, working entirely on paper, correctly predicted the hidden mathematical rulebook behind animal markings years before anyone could test it, and decades before anyone could prove he was right. There's one more layer to this pattern formation story worth knowing. These Turing patterns aren't fixed forever once they form. In embryonic development, the pattern locks in early and stays that way for life. But in adult animals, some of these reaction-diffusion systems stay active and adjustable. It's part of why a pufferfish's spot pattern or certain fish species' stripe patterns can shift or reorganize slightly as the animal grows larger. The same underlying mathematical system still quietly running in the background, decades after the animal was born. Let's zoom out from patterns on a surface to patterns in overall shape, because there's one more kind of math that shows up at every possible scale, from something inside your own chest to the largest rivers on Earth. Look at the branching pattern of a tree. Now look at a lightning bolt. Now look at the inside of your own lungs, the bronchial tubes splitting again and again into smaller and smaller branches, or the network of blood vessels running through your body. All of these share the same underlying mathematical property. They're fractals, patterns that look roughly similar to themselves no matter how far you zoom in. The mathematician most associated with formalizing this idea, Benoit Mandelbrot, actually built much of his early thinking around a deceptively simple question. How long is the coastline of Britain? It sounds like it should have one clean answer. It doesn't. Measure the coastline using a 100-kilometer ruler, and you get one length. Measure the exact same coastline using a 1-kilometer ruler, capturing every small inlet and headland the bigger ruler skipped over, and the total length gets noticeably longer. Keep shrinking your ruler, and the measured length keeps growing without ever settling on one fixed number. Mandelbrot showed mathematically that a coastline behaves less like a simple curve and more like a fractal, a shape whose complexity keeps revealing itself at every new scale you examine. Your lungs use this exact same fractal branching for an extremely practical reason: surface area. A perfectly smooth, balloon-shaped lung would have a tiny surface for absorbing oxygen. But by branching over and over, smaller and smaller, following a self-similar fractal pattern down to the tiniest air sacs, human lungs pack roughly 70 square meters of surface area, about the size of a small apartment, into a space that fits inside your rib cage. Rivers branch the same way to efficiently drain a watershed. Trees branch the same way to expose the maximum leaf surface to sunlight using the minimum material. Different problems, different biology, entirely unrelated evolutionary paths, converging again and again on the exact same mathematical solution: fractal branching. There's one last kind of mathematical pattern worth ending on because it's the strangest one of all. Patterns that only exist when you stop looking at a single animal and start looking at thousands of them moving together. Picture a massive flock of starlings at dusk. Thousands of birds moving as one shifting, flowing shape, twisting and reforming in midair, with no visible leader and no obvious plan. This phenomenon is called a murmuration, and for a long time, nobody was entirely sure how it worked. Then, starting in the mid-2000s, a research group in Italy called the Star Flag Project, led by physicist Andrea Cavagna, used high-speed stereo cameras to track the individual position of every single bird inside a real murmuration, sometimes involving thousands of starlings at once, all simultaneously. What they found was that each individual bird isn't reacting to the whole flock at all. Each bird is only paying attention to roughly its 7 nearest neighbors, adjusting its speed and direction based purely on those 7 birds, regardless of how close or far away they physically are. That's it. That's the entire rule. But when you run that simple, local 7-neighbor rule across a few thousand birds simultaneously, the mathematics of that interaction produces the massive, fluid, almost liquid-looking shape-shifting you actually see in the sky. Nobody is directing the flock. There's no leader bird calling the shape. It's the same principle as the honeycomb and the same principle as the Turing patterns. Extremely simple local rules followed by every individual member of a system, mathematically guaranteed to produce complex, coordinated, large-scale behavior that looks to any observer standing on the ground like it must have been planned. So here's what actually connects a sunflower, a beehive, a zebra, a lung, and a flock of birds. It's not that nature is somehow secretly obsessed with math, and it's definitely not that some external designer sprinkled equations across the natural world for us to later discover. It's the opposite, and it's a lot more interesting than that. These patterns show up again and again because they represent genuinely optimal solutions to real physical problems. How to pack the most seeds into the least space. How to store the most honey using the least wax. How to generate a pattern from a blank slate using nothing but chemistry. How to maximize surface area inside a fixed volume. How to move as a group without a leader. Math didn't get inserted into nature. Math is just the name we gave to the most efficient possible answer. And evolution, blind and directionless, keeps stumbling into that same answer over and over, because every less efficient answer eventually loses. The golden angle in a sunflower isn't beautiful because a mathematician said 1.618 is beautiful. It's mathematically inevitable, given millions of years and a simple, brutal filter. Waste sunlight, and you lose. Bees didn't read Euclid. They just kept the wax pattern that used the least material, generation after generation, until it became, without anyone planning it, a mathematically perfect proof that took human beings 2,000 years to formally catch up to.